Welcome back to another episode of CleanTechies, the podcast. This is a new season, season 2. It's been a while. Been away for the summer break, and I appreciate everybody joining us again for the podcast today. Just to get right back into things. This podcast is always, as always, sponsored and made possible by G2Venture Partners. So if you ever have any recruitment needs in the renewable energy space, G2Venture is doing a great job of differentiating themselves in the market as more than just a recruitment partner. So call G2Venture or reach out to G2Venture today to learn more. And let's get into a little bit of the details of today's episode. So today I had the opportunity of speaking with Valerie Shen of G2Venture Partners. So a really exciting opportunity to speak with her today and to kind of discuss the trends happening in the clean tech and climate tech investment space and some of the things they're working on, some of the things and challenges they've dealt with. Just a very exciting episode in general. I was really pumped to have this conversation, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. So without further ado, let's get into the episode. Awesome. Very good. Welcome to the podcast, Valerie. I'm really, really glad to have you today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Excited to be here with you.
Awesome. Very good. I'm very excited for this one. I obviously, wanted to get you guys in on this sooner, but I just moved to Florida shortly before you guys had reached out. But I'm very glad to be on this podcast with you today. So I guess for everybody listening, could you just give us like a really quick summary as to kind of who you are, what your background is, and what you're doing now?
Great. Yeah. My name is Valerie Shen. I'm currently the Chief Operating Officer at G2Venture Partners. We're a venture capital growth equity fund investing in what we call the digitization of traditional industries. So looking at transportation, logistics, manufacturing, agriculture, energy, how you take all the technology that's being created in the consumer digital world and apply it to these sectors in ways that make them more efficient and more sustainable. In terms of my background, I studied environmental science in undergrad. Sort of first was exposed to these topics actually in high school when I did speech and debate competitions. And the topics that were always exciting to me were around energy and climate. And then when I went off to college, the professor who ended up becoming my advisor was very inspirational early on. I saw that he had built a fascinating career out of doing research on climate topics and then also being a policy advisor around these issues. So studied environmental science in part inspired by him, and then quickly realized that of all the challenges that we have in the world, climate to me was by far the most pressing and also the one where we have so much uncertain risk if we don't do anything about this in the near term, right? Many of the other social issues that we live with, we've sort of lived with for decades, if not centuries. And we know that there are a lot of struggles, but also if we are another decade or two delayed in solving them, we kind of know what the outcomes will be. Whereas with climate, I think we are potentially going to hit cliffs where we don't even know what's going to happen. Plus, our predictions of what probably will happen if we don't change course are already scary enough. So that's sort of how the topic became really inspiring to me. And when I was thinking about what I wanted to do, I sort of saw tons of people who are scientists excited about climate, plenty of people in the policy world who are excited about these topics, but at the time, not enough people who are thinking about the business side of how do you make businesses more sustainable and how do you develop the technologies that are being created in labs to a point where they can be used and commercialized. So that's why I sort of decided to work on climate and go the business route for thinking about the environment.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. So it really was inspired throughout your university experience and kind of just digging deep into that and realizing how pressing it is that we need to solve these issues. That's kind of the same thing for me. I had a different upbringing, but generally, once I got into this space in the clean tech and renewable space, I just realized like how important it is. So I agree that's relatable. I'm curious, how did you end up with G2? I'd like to know maybe kind of some of the context in some of the roles you had in the past, and because I want to draw from that in the future when we talk here more about what your experiences have been in the past versus now, or have you always been focused on climate related investing? So could you just give us some more context there?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to try out a number of different internships way back in high school. I'm from Wisconsin. I saw you're also from Wisconsin, right?
No way, really? Yeah, I'm also from north central Wisconsin. Yeah.
Awesome. So I'm from Madison. My first ever internship was in high school, working in the Wisconsin State Assembly for our State Assembly Natural Resources Committee head. So got exposed to some issues there. And then when I was in college, my freshman summer, I worked in DC for the Wilderness Society. So thinking through some climate and environmental topics from an advocacy perspective. And then my sophomore summer, I worked in investment banking with Goldman Sachs based out of San Francisco. So focused in the clean tech group. Actually, the head of that group at the time is now one of our advisors at G2 to make the world very small. And then also worked a little bit on the IPO of Silver Spring Networks, which was in the Kleiner Perkins Green Growth Fund portfolio. And then I spent my next summer working at McKinsey as a management consultant, sort of the classic, I want to work in business, but I don't know exactly what I want to do, and was able to serve electric utility. Ended up going back to McKinsey full-time after school and worked for several electric utilities as well as oil and gas companies with the perspective of, if I want to understand how to disrupt the energy ecosystem and improve it for clean energy, it makes sense to know how the incumbents are working. That's actually a big part of our philosophy at G2. Our startups aren't going to fully displace incumbents, but rather they're going to be working with the incumbents to improve many of the existing systems. I also did an internship at Clean Power Finance, which was later renamed as Spruce, which was also in the Kleiner Green Growth Fund portfolio. And then ultimately found this team just by cold emailing one of my current partners. And he was nice enough to take the call back in 2012, stayed in touch for several years. He was a mentor as I was thinking through different life stages. And then as I was getting ready to leave McKinsey, reached out and sort of tried to understand if they were hiring. And that was the point where the Kleiner Green Growth Fund team was thinking about spinning out and raising G2Venture Partners. And so was lucky enough to be brought on, worked with the team for a year in that initial phase. And then I went off to Stanford for business school, got to do this program called the EIPER Joint Masters. So did a master's in environment and resources in conjunction with my MBA, during which I spent one summer interning at Google X on an early stage project around the electricity grids, and then spent my second summer working for Senator Mitt Romney in the US Senate, thinking it through climate policy. So a lot of different experiences along the way, all sort of centered around climate and energy. And then after all of this, decided that post-business school, the best place for me to be was still back with this team at G2Venture Partners. So came back as the chief operating officer and have been here since.
Awesome. That's a pretty interesting journey and a pretty quick span of time, to be honest. Obviously, seeing quite a lot of different areas. I think that that's something that I think probably brings good perspective to what you're doing now. So let's get into that. So in terms of what G2 is doing, could you talk a little bit more about kind of the philosophy behind their investment? I'm also curious to maybe dig into whatever you're interested in specifically, but the idea of not overtaking markets, but kind of working with the incumbent companies to deal with that. So I'm interested to just hear kind of your thoughts on that in general and the philosophy overall.
Great. Yeah. So in terms of what we're most excited about, we're usually investing at G2 in companies that are sort of in the Series B to Series D stage, already have several million, if not tens of millions of dollars of revenue, and are at an inflection point. And what we mean by that is we are excited about companies that are not necessarily first in the fundamental invention science experiment phase, but rather have a working product with customers who are excited about it and who we can really help grow from $10 million of revenue to 100+ million in revenue, and then ultimately to an exit. What we love to do is bring our industrial network to help those companies. So our LP base has a lot of the traditional investors, but we also have strategic industrials. So for example, Shell, Daimler, Mitsui, ABB, some of these are companies that, are very strong established players in transportation or in energy or in industrials. And they understand that their markets are changing and they don't want to sit around and be left behind. We think that our LPs are pretty far ahead in thinking through what the world should look like in the future. And they know, for example, in transportation, the world is not going to be gas-powered vehicles that everyone owns, one vehicle or two vehicles per family that sit idle 4% of the time, right? Instead, we're going to have a network of vehicles that are autonomous, electric, connected, and shared. And how are these big auto OEMs going to go from today to the future? Well, they realize that a big part of that is partnerships with startups, whether that's being customers of these startups or eventually acquiring them or working together on joint ventures. So we really like to find opportunities to connect our entrepreneurs with our strategic LPs and have them work together. A few other things just to think through in terms of what we're looking for is often we're thinking about industries that are quite old school and not necessarily digital, right? I think this was especially true 5 years ago when we were excited about transportation and energy and logistics, and the rest of the venture world had generally left that behind. We're starting to see in the last few years that a lot of traditional venture capitalists are also moving into this space, which we think is great and provides a lot of opportunity to really move from analog processes towards digital processes in ways that make them much more efficient. And because we're working generally in sectors that are resource intensive and have to do with real assets, more efficiency almost always means more sustainability and less resource use and resource waste. So that's how we think about impact and the environment as being core to all of the companies that we're funding.
Got it. So there's a couple of things. There's a lot of things to try to unpack here. I also want to focus on how we can educate people listening. What are some of the I'm kind of curious in terms of like, the ABB and Shells of the world, that are understanding that they need to do something about the future, because if they don't do something, kind of their business model might be at risk. What are the typical ways that they want to go forward? Because I know there's large companies who will sometimes just create their own company internally. Are they typically rather looking at a company like G2 and saying, hey, who are your portfolio companies? Who can we kind of fund through you, or just develop as partnerships? How is that typically looking? What are some of the challenges that they're facing and that you're trying to help them to solve?
Yeah. So we've sort of seen the whole gamut in terms of what these strategics are trying to do. Some of them are starting their own corporate venture arms, right? And those corporate venture arms, some of them are trying to focus on financial returns, but oftentimes it's about making investments into companies that are going to have some sort of strategic value. And then what we're seeing is both those corporate venture arms, as well as strategics who don't want to go through that process of setting up their venture team, are making investments directly into funds such as ours, because we're seeing more deal flow than they probably could see themselves, or even if they're seeing deal flow on their own, just an additional source of information. And for them, this is a combination of let's find great partners to work with. And also let's just make sure we're keeping track of what's happening in the landscape. And part of the way that we can help is there's not as much of a sort of like competitive vibe there, right? A startup might be concerned that if they're getting really close with one specific auto OEM or one specific oil and gas company, that's going to prevent them from being attractive to all of the others in the ecosystem. But by working more with a traditional venture capital fund, it's less of a one-to-one partnership that could be dangerous for their development.
Okay, so it gives them the flexibility on their own growth in terms of the new technologies as well. Okay, that's interesting. So, I guess I'm generally curious. I know it sounds like you didn't really do a whole lot in traditional finance or traditional venture capital, but I'm curious, from what you know, what do you see as kind of the big difference in how VC with climate focus is doing things versus traditional VC? Are there any major kind of differences that a lot of people have had to overcome? Are there big areas where people have entered the market with previous assumptions and that have turned out to be pretty bad, pretty rocky waters? What are some of those things that are changing in this space?
Yeah, well, one interesting thing that's been discussed a lot is whether or not you can make money by doing investing in clean tech. And we obviously think the answer is yes, part of the reason that we've been doing this for so long. My partner, Dave Mount, recently wrote a blog post about this, analyzing the returns that one would have gotten if you had made all of the investment that was invested in clean tech between 2006 and 2011, right? So in total, that was around $25 billion invested. And those companies are now worth over $600 billion. And that $25 billion invested would be worth north of $200 billion today. So substantial returns to have been made in clean tech. But in many of these situations, took longer than it took to get those same returns in the more consumer or traditional venture space. So I think one of the lessons is just making sure that you're patient throughout the process and knowing that if you're investing in things that do have hardware, it might take a little bit longer. Part of the way that we're solving this is investing in companies where we see a technology that's already working, or often looking for software companies that are still in this industrial space so that we can be getting returns for our LPs on the timeline that they expect. I think the other thing to understand, oh, yes, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So and the other piece of it, like we just talked about earlier, was just how important it is to be working hand in hand with those incumbents. I think one classic example is quite a few of our companies now and in the past sell into electric utilities, right? So then you have a specific set of skills around how do you work with utilities and how do you get them to be excited about your technology and get them to try things out and work on the time scale that you want. Something that more traditional VCs probably aren't as used to if they're selling more to consumers or a different type of customer.
Yeah, so this is something interesting. I think that, obviously there's lots of analogies that have been, brought up about when you have new technologies and you introduce them to the market, you still have to deal with the incumbent, right? If there's a 4-lane highway with 4 cars going 30 miles an hour, and that's the fastest cars, and then you build one that goes faster, you still can't just go fast because there's all the other cars plugging up the highway. So what are some of the ways, like what are some of the biggest challenges and in getting these incumbent companies, the companies that you have to work with because you need those partnerships, we need to really change the entire ecosystem. What are some of the ways that you're seeing your portfolio companies or that you guys are helping to influence these incumbent companies, these utilities, for example, in trying to be more innovative in the way they do things and kind of integrating with these newer technologies? What are some of those challenges and things you guys are doing?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is sort of getting them comfortable around risk, right? Often when you think about a utility, you're not talking about one individual person, you're talking about many people and committees that have been built up with processes specifically to make sure that no individual person is able to make a decision that's going to have major downstream consequences. But that also makes it harder for each individual person, even if there are awesome people willing to take risks, to be able to make a decision big enough to really push the needle. So I think a couple of interesting things about that. One is our mindset is we're serving incumbents to help make them more efficient, right? So trying to find ways to take their existing processes and improve them, and really not always to fundamentally change and displace what already exists. Another thing that we found works really well is these incumbent players are all sort of connected to each other. So if you can get one utility really excited about a product and get them to try it and have a success story, then you're far more likely to get others who are in their space or others that are connected with them to make that change. Especially because you'll then have the data and they'll sort of be taking a step that is more accepted already.
Yeah, that makes sense because obviously once you can get the curve turning, once people start to realize it works, that makes a lot of sense to them, and then they continue. This is interesting to me. This whole space is interesting. I'm just curious to know from your perspective. You obviously see a lot of different companies. You probably help scan through all these different opportunities to some extent. What are some of the big trends that you find very interesting, or that you find even more that have a lot of potential in terms of successful investments for the actual financial returns within the climate tech sector? Because there's obviously many things, and it might help if you want, for people listening, to break down kind of the main sectors, if you guys have a way of dividing them out, because I know there's so many things. So what are some of those areas?
Yeah, so we think about, like you said, a bunch of different sectors. Maybe I just highlight a couple of them. One piece of it that we've been looking at a lot is transportation, right? And in transportation, the idea here is we want a future where we have autonomous and electric vehicles, and that allows vehicles to all be connected and talk to each other, have use camera telematics and other systems to monitor what's going on and improve the minor operations. And then also to make sure that these vehicles are not necessarily owned by one individual and sitting around all the time, but rather part of a whole ecosystem that's connected together. And if you think about what we have today versus what that future looks like, you have tons of different technology, whether it's the hardware or the software or like marketplaces. And we're excited about all of that. Another chunk is logistics and supply chain. And this applies to sort of all sorts of goods and people that are being moved. We really believe in collapsing various steps of the supply chain so you don't have, for example, in food, a product that's being moved 15 times between the farmer and the end consumer, but rather being able to move it direct to consumers in ways that can make the food be fresher, have less emissions associated with transport, less waste from things rotting along the way, less emissions from things just like constantly being moved around, right? And how do you do that? Part of it is by taking assets that are right now just physical and no one really knows where they are and being tracked by clipboards to having platforms that are tracking these electronically and really matching suppliers with the distributors with the end consumers in a much more effective way. And then if you're doing that, you start to think more about how do you automate your warehouses and how do you automate last mile transport and delivery? And how do you think about just like taking all of these individual pieces and moving them in automated ways, but then also protecting workers and protecting all the individual people that are part of that chain. And then a sort of separate chunk that we're starting to think about is retail and e-commerce. And so that means, for the end consumer, how are you going to interface with the platforms that you're buying from? Who's going to decide what are the products that are going to be available? How do you make sure that you're producing products that people actually want so you don't have extensive waste? And then how do you produce those products in the safest way possible? Really, I feel like I've now covered almost every sector of the economy. So it's a pretty broad scope, but it's all with that underlying theme of efficiency and using technology to make your processes better.
Yeah, one thing I found interesting from what I've learned is that there's so many. Obviously, we have to reinvent the entire way we live life, right? Everything, every physical product has to be reinvented essentially to some extent, or at least reimagined how we produce it to create lower emissions. So I'm curious, what would you say is kind of the way you guys find specifically technology only companies, right? Because it sounds like that you said that it's all digitalization, correct? That you focus on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so how do you go about finding those companies and how do you know when it's a winner, right? How do you know that it's going to really win? Because I'm assuming that there's just so many opportunities, but at the same time, you have to be very careful which ones you're going to go with to make sure it's a winner. Is it about the tech? Is it about the team? What are some of those things?
We really like to find companies through a process that we call a deep dive. This means that we're thinking about a sector that we've concluded is or probably is interesting. And then we'll spend multiple months really getting smart on that sector, talking to all the companies that we can in the space, talking to industry experts, and then talking to potential customers and suppliers into that sector. This is part of where our strategic LPs come in handy, and they're really helpful in the process, and really mapping out our landscape for what is going to be a successful company, say in LiDAR, and what are the metrics that the customers are looking for. Of all the companies that we've seen, how are they currently scoring across all of these metrics? And then you can sort of have a sense of, we believe a winner should look like X, Y, and Z. And then we really like to focus on how the customer is reacting, right? We can do all the analysis that we want on the technology, but ultimately the customers are the ones that are making the decision. So looking at revenue changes, looking at how customers are or are not continuing to purchase the product, that can be really helpful for us. And then specifically talking to the customers to understand why they do or don't like a product. This is really why we focus at a stage where our investments are already post-revenue. So we really have customers that we can talk to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So another thing, there's so many things I'm trying to like cover here. There's so many interesting topics, but another thing, that I feel like both of us being from Wisconsin, I don't know if you encountered it as much being in Madison, obviously a little bit bigger city. Um, I found a lot of people in Wisconsin, especially in the Northwoods and just generally in the United States, kind of have this negative outlook on clean tech or climate tech, whatever it is. They consider it to be destroying the economy or whatever, right? They just don't really believe in the economic viability of it. So what are some of the big myths that you guys have had to help expel? Obviously, I'm assuming most of the people you interface with are already on board with these things. But I'm curious if you guys have done anything to help educate the general public on the actual viability of the investment of these projects, because I think that could go hand in hand with people supporting the government's kind of play to support these ventures by putting infrastructure money into these items. So what are some of those things that we could talk about?
I think it's a great question. One of the exciting statistics that came out a year or two ago was, I want to say in 2018, 74% of existing coal plants, so coal plants that were already built, right, were more expensive to operate than new renewable electricity, which, if you think about it, means that we're already at a point where investing in renewables doesn't mean you're paying more for the sake of the environment, but rather it's profitable to be getting your electricity from renewable sources even when your coal plant already exists, just because the cost of the actual fossil fuels to maintain and operate is so expensive now compared to some of the cheap renewable energy sources we have, which is a great milestone to hit, right? I think the people who did this study said that that number is going to be 86% by 2025. So in the vast majority of situations, it's going to be better and cheaper, even if you don't care about the environment, to work with renewable electricity. So we're no longer asking people to make sacrifices in that sense. Another example is Proterra, which is an electric bus company that's in our portfolio. Proterra is deployed in the majority of states in the US, including some states where you wouldn't necessarily think that the politicians or citizens really care about the climate impacts. But there you can start to think about all the other major benefits, including on the cost side, it's cheaper often to run an electric bus when you think about the maintenance costs and such. So a little bit more expensive upfront, but just on a total cost of ownership perspective, better to run with renewables. And then if you think about the more near-term impacts, for example, with Proterra, if you're running clean electric buses in your city, you're not dealing with all of that urban air pollution, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something that, regardless of whether or not you believe in climate change, it's going to improve your life on a day-to-day basis today just by using the cleaner resource. And I think there's a lot of examples where we can focus on that, where renewables are already the cheaper option and where, separate from the climate impact, there are going to be places where the products that we're pushing are better for everyone involved.
Yeah, see, that's the thing that just blows my mind away, is that it was always this kind of assumption growing up, and everybody around you just basically didn't believe it's possible. But then you find out that in reality, it's cheaper and it's better for the environment. So like, and it creates a lot of new jobs too. I think that's an interesting thing, is there's not, this whole push for clean tech and renewables in general doesn't leave out rural communities. There's so many jobs to be had for manufacturing. I feel like there's actually so many incredible things that are going to happen to manufacturing personally, and with the way that we produce all of our products. So I think that there's going to be a lot of smaller communities that will benefit from this. So it's very interesting. I guess one thing I'm curious about is, what would you say are some of the biggest struggles that you guys run into in general?
I think one of the struggles is just thinking through the timelines of all of the different things that we're trying to do, right? We have a fund that's a 10-year fund life. We're making investments. We want to make sure we're investing in the best new technologies, but also that in the right amount of time, we can help that company get to a great exit and return capital to our LPs. And then when you think about timelines on a shorter scale, it's, we really like to get to know our companies, and we want to make sure that we are talking to the founders and building that relationship before we're making that investment. And then sometimes we're seeing things that are moving on so fast of a timeline that we're not always able to do the right amount of diligence, and trying to sort of adjust to that new normal there. I think the other thing that is both good and bad is that there are a lot of people who historically have not been investing in clean energy or sustainability or climate tech that are now entering into the space, which we generally think is really good for the ecosystem, but also means that there's sort of a different set of norms for what everyone is looking for, which can lead to a variety of different expectations and valuations. And it doesn't feel like the dust has settled yet in terms of what the market is going to look like.
Yeah, this is something I think would be interesting. Maybe you could speak to this a little bit, and maybe the history of kind of the clean tech and then into what we call now climate tech investing. Maybe could you speak about the history of how a lot of these tech firms kind of started investing in clean technologies, assuming that they would receive these returns, and then how it ended up and where they're at now?
Yeah, of course. So our team was first created back in 2008. We were at Kleiner Perkins running the Green Growth Fund. And that was part of what is often referred to now as CleanTech 1.0, right? The first wave of clean tech with over $25 billion invested into the sector. And a lot of that was around what we think of as traditional clean energy. So electricity generation with solar, with wind, with biofuels. And that was really hot for a while. And then there were a few very high profile failures that I think gave the whole industry a bad rep. As we know today, many of the companies that were invested in that phase have actually done incredibly well. One of the examples in our portfolio is Enphase Energy, which makes microinverters. And then also, of course, Tesla, which everyone has heard about, sustainable meat company Beyond Meat, right? There's a lot of good examples of successes, but there were enough sort of struggles early on that quite a few investors got spooked and sort of moved away from CleanTech 1.0. And then there was a phase sort of in the late 2010s when our team was still investing in this space, but broadened beyond just energy. So thinking about transport and food and agriculture and logistics and all of that. But there weren't that many other venture investors who were interested. Most of venture had sort of moved to more enterprise SaaS consumer type things. Right? So we were a little bit alone and we were thinking about what kinds of investments really make a difference in climate. It doesn't have to just be energy. It's actually anything that uses energy and uses resources, which is why we added transportation and food and manufacturing and logistics and all of that into our purview. And then what we've seen in the last couple of years is there's a huge resurgence in interest in this space, but similar to how we've expanded beyond energy, the whole theme around climate tech is no longer just about producing electricity in cleaner ways, but rather everything that uses electricity and resources. And we're seeing this from people who want to be focused just on climate tech, but also just from investors in general who realize that this is a huge part of the economy. So if you're a generalist investor, you should also be a climate tech investor because that's such a big part of the world, right? And I think that this is coupled with several things. One, the realization that this will make money. If we're going to move to 50% renewables by 2030 or 50% reduction in emissions, that's hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars of opportunity. It would be crazy for anyone to sort of leave that untouched, right? And then you also have interest from investors like our LPs who just think, wow, this is a really important issue. I want to invest more money into funds that care about this. And then you have consumers that are also saying, wow, like I'm feeling the heat waves. I'm feeling all of these crazy wildfires. I'm seeing the effects of climate change. It's crazy for me to not do something about this. So there's a huge market for companies and products that are working on climate tech and catering to a class of consumers who start to care. So we're at a point right now where we feel that all of the factors are moving together in a way that's going to push climate tech really to the forefront of each conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious for anybody who's spent time in the space. If people are listening in who don't know, it's, I mean, it's exploding right now. Everybody, literally, it's going off, and there's no way to stop it. Essentially, thank goodness we have to get moving. So I think it's very interesting. Yeah, so interesting what is all happening, and to me, being kind of like future oriented person, just I'm so excited to see like the way life will be in 10 years, right? It's going to be so much better, so much different. I know I'm the kind of person who will adopt things early. Many people aren't. So it might be hard for them, but they'll get around to it. Awesome. Well, just I guess any final thoughts to close out the podcast, anything you want to share with the audience about what you guys are doing, any maybe advice or kind of encouragement to entrepreneurs in the space, people kind of just looking to make a difference. What are your thoughts?
We're always excited to hear from entrepreneurs in the space. So if you're building a company in that sort of tens of millions of dollars of revenue phase, like I mentioned earlier, a pretty broad set of sectors for what we define as being relevant to climate tech, please feel free to reach out. All of our email addresses are on our website at g2vp.com. In terms of advice, I guess what I'd say is everything seems to go through cycles. So if you're working on something that you believe is exciting and it doesn't feel like everyone else is excited about it right now, you can almost always find someone who's going to believe in it with you. And if you're on the right track and you're doing the right thing, there will be a time when others sort of jump on board as well. That's what we saw in the last several years with climate tech when it wasn't hot. And now we're really excited that it is popular and really moving again.
Yeah, I mean, just think about all the people who stuck it out, right? The people who were
Yes.
working on their research and development, and they finally, now the money comes around, and now they're, changing the world really. So, yeah, definitely appreciate that. Appreciate that advice. It's always great to hear. So awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Definitely excited to see what you guys do and what your portfolio companies can accomplish, and we'll be following them and keeping an eye out keeping an eye out on what they're doing in the future.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to have you on again sometime.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us on today's episode of the podcast. As always, such a great conversation. I hope you learned a lot. I hope you had a lot of takeaways. Definitely be sure to take some notes and maybe do some follow-up research to learn more about the space on your own time. As always, we're trying to build this and trying to the purpose of this podcast is to just help other people get into the loop of what's being done in the space to help combat climate change. There's so many interesting things. And I think this is a great conversation to kind of discuss from a money perspective where their heads are at, what they're doing, and challenges they face. So thank you for listening to today's episode. If you'd like to get further involved, feel free to join our Slack channel. We have a Slack channel that we've been building very slowly but surely, just to try to connect other people who are interested in the space. Whether you're an expert in clean tech or climate tech, or maybe just interested, feel free to join that. Link in the description, and maybe meet some other people and potentially even get your next job opportunity through there. So definitely get in touch there. As also would like to mention, we've been doing this for a while. We want to make sure people are aware that we are continuing to put out a monthly newsletter at this time, kind of diving into a little bit different type of topics. Typically, Randy and I are doing a little bit of research on some specific topic, helping people to be aware of the problem, and then kind of bringing to light some of the solutions that are there through the companies that we've been talking to. A lot of the companies mentioned in that newsletter have been people I've interviewed on here. So it's kind of a nice thing to bring full circle. So it definitely, if you're interested in learning a little bit more detailed stuff, sign up for the newsletter. That's, again, coming up monthly at the moment. We might change that in the future, but currently it's coming out every month on the 27th. And it's a great way to just be in touch with us and, have some content to read. Not too much, just not to overwhelm your inboxes, just a little bit. And then, feel free to reach back out to us through there. It's a great way for us to get feedback, any ideas or thoughts you have on the show. People you'd like to see. We're definitely open to feedback. So do that. Let us know there. You can also, reach out to me through LinkedIn or Twitter, Silas Maynor, and give us your feedback there and let us know what your thoughts were. We always love to hear more. And the whole goal is for us to spread and share the word of what's going on in the space. So if you felt there was something specifically of interest, maybe if you're watching on YouTube, you can share the show at a specific place that you found interesting and share with a friend of yours that you might think would be good to hear what was discussed. So thank you again so much for joining us on today's episode, and as always, we'll see you next time.